Hello, my curious cats, and welcome to episode 11 of the Say Psychology podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. Okay, so we did take a small break last week. It was kind of needed, just to get ourselves centered between the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2, but we are officially back on regular scheduled programming. Woo! And in case you didn't catch that, we are officially starting season 2 today. Woo! So if you know me, you know that I'm really the type of person who starts a project or starts a hobby and then I'll eventually end up forgetting about it a week later. I really thought this podcast was kind of going to be like that, I'm not going to lie, but it's not. I'm really, really enjoying it. Probably because it's the two things in the world that I love the most. Psychology and talking to myself. But no, I'm kidding. Like I said, I'm truly enjoying it, and you guys just keep me motivated. Your constant comments, your subscriptions, your following, please keep it coming, because truly it's what keeps me motivated. So season 1, it was really more just like a wacky random kind of thing, just kind of get a feel for it. But starting with season 2, I really want to start incorporating themes into each season. And starting with season 2, I want to start looking at the government and some of their most insane studies on the human psyche. And honestly, what better way to start off season 2 and the government theme than with their most infamous study? I'm talking about Project MK Ultra. What many people don't know, though, is that Project MK Ultra can be split into 3 different studies. And we are going to be looking at each different study in 3 different respective episodes. Project Artichoke, Project MK Ultra, and Operation Midnight Climax. Okay, so yes, this is going to be a 3-parter, and that's because, like I mentioned, essentially there are 3 different projects that, when all put together, is what we know as Project MK Ultra as a whole, right? So these next 3 weeks, we're going to dive deeper into the official, now declassified story of MK Ultra itself. Honestly, if you know me, you know that I am obsessed with this study, not just because of the details and what conspired out of it, but it's because it's a story that we don't and we may never know the whole truth to. In fact, there's people out there that believe that Project MK Ultra is still thriving behind government doors. Okay, now that may sound a bit tinfoil hatty, but once you start digging into it, it doesn't sound that crazy. You may sound crazy, but the story itself does not sound that crazy. So without further ado, this week we're diving into the initial project that started it all. Project Artichoke, a program developed by the CIA to study interrogation methods on human subjects, quickly became just the start of the government's most incredulous, secretive, and controversial studies to date. Let's step aside from psychology for just a split second and let's have ourselves a small history lesson, okay? Stick with me. By the end of World War II in 1945, the United States and the USSR had become allies. And as we know, their cooperation had been a giant essential influence on the defeat of Nazi Germany and of Axis powers. Although, despite their working together, the US had their doubts about the Soviet nation and Stalin's impact and influence on the Soviet citizens. So much so that the US was terrified that Russia's expansionism would lead to communist leadership and conquering the whole world. They took a big leap there, okay? Essentially, the US said trust no one. And this was post the World War, though, okay? So it kind of makes sense that the US was a little iffy on the way of the Soviet nation's actions and intentions and what they would lead to. So you kind of get it when you see it through their point of view, you kind of get it, right? But interestingly, this was actually quite the dichotomy, because the USSR was harboring their own resentment towards the US as well. Okay, given that the US had a pretty late entry into the Second War, and as a response to their late entry, it led to the deaths of millions of Russian soldiers. So they themselves, the Soviets, they themselves were like, okay, we too have some beef here, okay? It's not just one-sided. By the late 1940s, both sides were equally powerful and mutually distrusting of each other, and as we just discussed, for some very valid reasons. Given that World War II had just ended, neither one was looking to invest in another war. I mean, not that either of them couldn't, it just wasn't in the cards, right? So instead of another world war, they resorted to a 40-year face-off known today as the Cold War. Awesome. The Cold War wasn't exactly about dropping bombs and killing millions of civilians on the front lines, but rather what the two, the US and the USSR, aimed to do was to advance their atomic weaponry. Although the two swore they wouldn't use it on each other, each nation challenged each other in order to prove who was the best, who had the best atomic weaponry, who was more strategic, essentially, who was the smartest. All in all, this little contest between the two nations got a little bit out of hand. What at first was supposed to be strictly governmental research soon spread to the public and people began to panic. Okay? See, all over, people were being accused of being communists peddling propaganda. This was especially detrimental in Hollywood when hundreds of celebrities and writers were blacklisted under this suspicion. It got to the point where all around, regular people and regular civilians began to believe that everyone around them was a spy. Housewives began accusing their neighbors of going through their trash, businessmen were afraid they were being bugged, and pretty much everyone believed they were being stalked by the USSR. Looking back, this type of paranoia is what we would call mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria for short. It is a social and psychological phenomenon that causes collective anxiety due to perceived threat, followed by irrational behavior among a large group of individuals. There is no known part of the brain that controls mass hysteria, although there are some theories on parts that may be involved. For example, particularly the amygdala, which controls emotional processing emphasis on fear and anxiety, the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, activated by willed action such as goal-directed behavior, and specific limbic systems such as the cingulate or the orbital frontal cortex, both activated by conversion symptoms such as emotional issues that have been triggered by stressful events. The mass hysteria got to the point where US citizens began to truly believe the worst. And as they should, honestly. But see, the paranoia got so bad that US citizens began to believe that the USSR was using mind control on them. Okay, now you may be asking, how did we go from checking your trash cans to mind control? Well, you see, my curious cats. Around the same time, rumors began to circle around about American prisoners of war returning home after World War II as these mindless drones sent to advertise communist propaganda. Honestly, when I read about these mindless drones, the first thing that came to mind was that one scene from the SpongeBob SquarePants movie where Plankton has this his army of chum bucket soldiers where they're wearing the chum bucket hats and they're essentially being controlled by these helmets. Do you know what I'm talking about? I know my millennials know what I'm talking about. So anyways, the media ate these rumors up, I'm telling you. Newspapers started publishing stories with headlines like "New Evil Seen in Brainwashing" and "Brainwashing versus Western Psychiatry." And I mean, when your only source of information at the time is spewing headlines such as these, it's a no wonder people were quite literally losing their minds. US citizens everywhere believed that they were at risk for Soviet mind control. Now, you would think that a thought like this would cause a normal person to go a little bit berserk or a little bit insane in the membrane. However, in a way, these beliefs gave people a feeling of comfort. Okay, now stick with me here. You see, by knowing that the Soviets were using mind control on them, they now understood the reason for the Soviets' swift and rapid rise to power. Of course the US isn't beating the USSR in the Cold War. The Soviets have mind control, for God's sake. Duh, it all made sense now, right? Do you get what I'm saying? It was a sense of comfort just to have an answer, closure. And if there's one thing that the human psyche absolutely loves, it's closure. So it may not have been the most logical or even the most realistic, but it was an answer nonetheless. Now, US citizens were plagued with another question. Would the Soviets ever be stopped? Let's welcome our first main character, Dr. L. Wilson Green, Technical Director of the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. In 1949, Dr. L. Wilson Green was tipped off to a series of chemical trials being done in Switzerland. There was another doctor down in Switzerland by the name of Dr. Albert Hofmann, who had been rumored to have recently discovered a dangerous and new biological material. At the time, it was considered to be the substance of the century because it would eventually go on to be the quietest weapon of the entirety of the Cold War. Essentially, Dr. Hoffman was experimenting with an enzyme that was found naturally in a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. Being the scientist that he is, Hoffman tested the enzyme on himself before administering it to other test subjects. Initially, Hoffman's enzyme was created as an effort to discover a cure for poor blood circulation. However, as he tested it out himself, his little naturally grown enzyme, he quickly discovered a much more interesting use for it. Upon consuming his little enzyme, Hoffman was overcome by a spell of dizziness followed by, quote, an uninterrupted stream of fantastic images of extraordinary plasticity and vividness accompanied by an intense kaleidoscope-like play of colors, unquote. Okay, wow, that is quite the choice of words, Dr. Hoffman. It turns out Hoffman had accidentally discovered the hallucinogenic drug of LSD. Imagine what that must have been like the very first ever LSD trip. Thank goodness it sounds like it was a good one, okay? Can you imagine the first ever LSD trip being a bad one? This story would be completely different. Completely different, okay? Well, back in DC, Dr. L. Wilson Green, remember him? He had begun to assemble a report based on Dr. Hoffman's findings in Switzerland. Although, like I mentioned before, Dr. Hoffman intended to use this drug to lower blood pressure and help with general human health. Green saw great value in Hoffman's work. Okay, so much so that he came up with the brilliant idea to somehow find a way to incorporate his findings in matters of national security. Again, what a leap. Okay, he quickly hopped on his computer or his typewriter, or I don't know, this was the early 1950s, okay? But he gathered the information and created a separate file that he named Psychochemical Warfare, a new concept of war, and quickly pitched the idea and his proposal to other governmental departments. This proposal was a little different in DC for many reasons. The main being that Green's proposal wasn't asking for bomb or weaponry funding, which is typically what the US government would expect from a research proposal. Rather, his proposal was suggesting that the government begin testing the newly discovered LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs such as mescaline. His proposal included detailed plans on how he planned to weaponize these drugs. He hypothesized that if successful, these psychedelic drugs would allow for a break in human perception and manipulation for the enemies into giving up their most secretive information while under the influence. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, listen. When you really submerge yourself into researching this study, you kind of get the feeling that Green ultimately did have the public's best interest in mind by 0.00001%. Okay, remember, the Cold War wasn't about killing the enemy via bombs and machinery, but rather always to be one step ahead of the enemy. In his proposal, Green claimed, quote, I am convinced that it is possible by means of the techniques of chemical psychological warfare to conquer an enemy without the wholesale killing of his people and mass destruction of his property. Like I said, it wasn't about fighting on the front lines, it was about being better than the enemy. Green's proposal quickly gained traction in DC. Every official who read it passed it up to the next higher up until it eventually made it to the Oval Office, where President Truman approved it and he was allowed to start testing psychedelic drugs. So, in 1950, the CIA got to working alongside Dr. Green and his LSD at a military base in Maryland. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the special ops were given permission to synthesize these drugs, not actually test them. And this, my curious cats, is where the CIA comes in. The CIA's biggest concern was cracking the code to mind control so they could use it on the enemy. So, in April of 1950, the director of the CIA at the time, Roscoe Hillenkotter, decided it was time to take it up a notch. This was newly discovered LSD. How many notches are there, was my question. Well, it turns out there's a lot more than I could have ever imagined. Okay? When it comes to the government and the CIA, the limit of notches does not exist. Hillenkotter created a project referred to as Project Bluebird. It was named Project Bluebird because the objective of the project was to get the enemy to sing like a bird. Which, honestly, that is so cunt for the science community. Love that. So, as we've learned thus far, the CIA was obsessed with the idea of mind control at this point, right? And they wanted to take Green's proposal and put it to the test. So the CIA created Project Bluebird, a project whose primary focus was to study a variety of interrogation techniques to get the enemy to spill. Now remember, this is the government we're talking about. There is no limit when it comes to being delusional. We're number one was practically the American anthem at this point. So, if their priority is mind control and they essentially have no limit, what makes us think that they're going to stop at drugs? Yes, mind controlling drugs were just the tip of the iceberg of Project Bluebird. In the 1950s, the US decided it was officially time to put Project Bluebird to the test. As for test subjects, that wasn't a problem. See, post-World War II, the US was housing a small interrogation site in a small town in Germany known as Camp King. The camp was a home to dozens of German and Nazi war prisoners, which meant it was fully stocked with test subjects that the US government could abuse in the name of science. Which is kind of eerie if you think about it, you know? Now, regardless of practically having a giant pool of test subjects for this twisted little experiment, it still wasn't secretive enough for the CIA. I know, we're back at the notches dilemma. So, what they did was they set up a separate testing facility just outside of Camp King where they would quietly transport the prisoners to officially perform the experiment in total secrecy. At Camp King, the prisoners would be injected with depressants that had hypnotic effects, while at the same time, operants would issue them potent stimulants. I don't think you understand the scope of the damage this cocktail of drugs had on the prisoners, okay? When it was okay, when the damage was okay, these drugs would attack the lungs and the nervous system, resulting in seizures and suffocation. And that's, again, when it was okay. Right when the prisoners were at their breaking point, when the operants could see that their bodies were about to give out, the CIA operatives would begin testing the variety of mind control techniques. These mapped out techniques included hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation. The goal was to get even the toughest prisoner to break and start talking. Now, the CIA began to find themselves a little stumped because they soon realized that they actually had no idea what the fuck they were doing. I mean, they had their prisoners, they had their chemicals, and they had a protocol. But what they didn't have was something or someone who knew how to measure whether their techniques were working or not, how they were or were not working, and to what extent. So the CIA decided they needed someone who could do just that. They needed someone outside of the CIA, so not to carry over bias into the experiments, but also someone who was just as much of a snake as them. Someone smart enough to understand the scope of the project, but also evil enough to not mind ruining people's lives. Let's welcome to the stage Dr. Sidney Gotley. So in 1951, Dr. Gotley showed up to his first day at the CIA in DC. Funny enough, he'd agreed to take on the job, but truly had no idea why he was there or what they needed from him. Like, the CIA handpicked him from a large pool of contestants and told him he had been picked to operate a new unit, and he just said, okay. No, what's the starting salary? No, do you guys offer dental and vision? Just straight vibes, I guess. Like, again, I'm better due. Might as well, right? But don't get me wrong, okay? Gotley was a very smart man, a PhD in chemistry, and interesting hobbies such as writing poetry and raising goats. Talk about a go-getter. After his interview, where he spoke of his quest for answers outside religion, Gotley was quickly made chief of the chemical operation. With a new chief of staff, the CIA decided it best to start fresh, almost from scratch. With that mindset, they also changed the name from Project Bluebird to Project Artichoke. It's not sure why artichoke of all the vegetables out there, but that's what they went with. Personally, I think Project Bluebird had a much better ring to it, but no one ever asked for my opinion, so whatever, I guess. Now remember, when it comes to the US government, the limit of notches does not exist. With a new chief of staff and a new project name, the CIA decided it was time to take it up another notch. The CIA said, forget Project Bluebird, that was too vanilla. We need something more rough, okay? More intense than a bluebird, more intense than a singing bird. The operatives at the Camp King were ordered by the CIA to continue carrying out the current interrogation techniques, which, as I mentioned, included hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and sensory deprivation. But now, they were ordered to start recording the experiments, which honestly, I'm surprised they weren't already. I mean, sure, they had to save their asses, but this is the CIA, okay? Like, I'm sure they knew prior to the experiments, how to safely record something like that. But again, what do I know? By mid-1951, the CIA had prison camels full of test subjects in Germany, Japan, and Panama. They changed the name and said, Godspeed. Now, this may be hard to believe, but the project and its techniques had not produced a single valid result. But the CIA was so convinced, without any solid proof, by the way, that the Soviets had already perfected mind control themselves, and they were going to stop at nothing until they did too. So, back to the new guy, Dr. Gotley. By now, he was convinced that the answer lied in psychopharmacology, the study of how drugs affect a person's mood, sensations, thinking, and behaviors. He was familiar with previous studies done using THC, but found it useless given that it did nothing for interrogation tactics because it just produces states of relaxation among the prisoners. And just imagine that for a sec, okay? You have this big, tough CIA guy trying to force mind control on a man who's just stoned out of his mind. The complete opposite of what the CIA was hoping to achieve. So, they took it up another notch. The CIA thought it smart to start injecting mentally ill prisoners with cocaine. Although they found that cocaine did make the prisoners start yapping, the CIA didn't feel like their thought process was consistent enough to be used as a form of interrogation. So they thought, hey, let's try heroin and mescaline next. See how that makes a difference. But no, neither one was conclusive enough to be used for interrogation. The prisoner's thought process was too unpredictable, according to the CIA. Okay, first of all, what thought process? Second of all, look at who you're testing on, okay? My goodness. Let's keep in mind that these were all unwilling test subjects as well, okay? And now they've also added the mentally ill into their subject pool. However, no one at the CIA batted an eye because, all in the name of science, right? So when THC, cocaine, heroin, and mescaline proved to be inconsistent, they took a second look back at LSD. Gotley, much like our earlier boy Green, thought it smart to test it on himself first. This was his first trip, and thank goodness it was a good one, because he described it as overwhelming but euphoric. In fact, he liked it so much that he became convinced that LSD would be the end-all solution for all of Project Artichoke's problems. Those are some big words, Gotley. So, in the name of science, of course, Gotley started taking volunteers to also try out the effects of LSD. Most, if not all, of the volunteers were CIA ops. Reports indicate that most of the volunteers didn't try the drug just the one time either, because, for science. However, results showed that the reactions were just as inconclusive as the other prior drugs. Some became docile, less inhibited, while others became convinced that they were delusional, they were acting rebellious, and uncooperative with the other scientists. This is what we normal people would call a bad trip. But for science. Now, eventually, LSD made it out of DC and to Camp King in Germany. Apparently, the CIA thought that the results would be more conclusive with the war prisoners compared to the CIA ops. Okay? But sadly, LSD turned out to not be the truth serum they were hoping for. This LSD experiment went on for 18 months, regardless of the many mixed results. At the end of the 18 months, the CIA still had no concrete evidence that hallucinogenic drugs could be used for mind control. But hey, results or not, they were receiving funding, and the chief operator, our boy Gotley, kept receiving his hefty paycheck. So he remained persistent that he truly believed LSD could unlock the secret part of the brain that could make prisoners talk. In early 1953, Gotley decided it was time to crank up Project Artichoke yet another notch. He proposed that the CIA launch an entirely new, more expansive operation on mind control. Project Artichoke was already completely inhumane and abusive as it was, and these guys wanted to take it up another notch? I'm sorry, but what's that definition of insanity again? It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Yeah, that sounds about right. But sadly, the CIA was more than happy to amplify it. In April of 1953, Gotley's proposal was approved by the CIA. With the approval, he was granted $300,000, which equates to about $3 million today, as well as full permission to launch his proposed research experiment at his own discretion. And just like Project Bluebird became Project Artichoke officially became Project MK Ultra. Well, my curious cats, that is where our story is going to end this week. Next week, we'll be exploring the madness at the heart of Project MK Ultra. So don't forget to tune in to see where the now official story takes us. Again, welcome to Season 2. We have a lot in store for these next few episodes. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please like, subscribe, review, follow, and share with other curious cats. Please leave your thoughts and comments on today's episode, and please leave any suggestions for future episodes because I want to know what y'all want to know. Stay up to date with news and episodes on the podcast Instagram page at the Say Psychology Podcast. As always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.